Welcome to the Show Me Institute podcast. I'm Zach Lawhorn from Show Me Opportunity, and today I'm joined by Susan Pendergrass and Patrick Tuohey from the Show Me Institute. So today we're going to be talking about some work that the two of you have done on public safety and crime, specifically in the city of St. Louis. But before we get into the project, I want to talk to you both about your perception of crime as people who have both lived in and frequently visit the city of St. Louis. So, Susan, I want to start with you. Before you started this project, before you started looking at the data, um, when someone said, "Is the city of St. Louis dangerous? Do you have to worry about it?" What was your perception before you started this project?
Well, I only moved to the city of St. Louis in 2015. So there's a long period of time before I lived there, and I was in DC for part of that. And my perception before I moved there was that it was dangerous. The Ferguson incident had just happened, and I knew that there was a lot of crime. But then when I moved to St. Louis, my husband and I decided to live in the city itself, and we loved our neighborhood. It was the coolest. We had this super cool house built around the time of the World's Fair. It was amazing, but I never felt really safe. I felt like we had a lot of, we started leaving our car doors open because our cars would get rifled through. I had a smash and grab within 2 weeks. I called to report to smash and grab and was told that they don't take reports on them. That was new for me. And then we had to keep a lot of lights on outside. We didn't really walk our dogs after dark. And I just had this kind of feeling like and I felt like lots of times I would go by police cars sitting on corners idling, but it didn't necessarily make me feel safer because I wasn't sure, how much they were doing. In addition, I realized people run stoplights, run stop signs, use the right parking lane to pass. And that was all new for me. So I kind of got this feeling that the rule of law wasn't enforced very well in the city. And that just doesn't feel good as somebody who has bought a house there and who lives there.
And Patrick, as someone who lives in Kansas City across the state, so two questions. One, what do you think the perception is over there on the western half of the state? And then, as someone who comes into St. Louis regularly, what was your perception of the safety situation in the city?
I think a lot of the issues that Susan and I explored in this paper, which we'll talk about, bore out here in Kansas City, which is, I've lived in cities my whole life. I understand that every city is going to have the parts you don't want to go to, the parts that are rougher than others. Kansas City certainly has that. I've had my car broken into here in my driveway a number of times. No real damage, and it's not something I reported to the police. But as far as traveling to St. Louis, I've been going to St. Louis since the late 90s. Before I lived in St. Louis, I was in Washington, D.C., or forgive me, before I lived in Kansas City, I was in Washington, D.C. And I loved St. Louis. I still do. I would see Creve Coeur. I would see the Central West End. I would sometimes stay at the Westin downtown. But living in DC and growing up in DC, I kind of understood that every city is going to have the places that you don't want to go. I understood that St. Louis often gets maybe ranked higher than it should because the city's footprint is so small. But it never felt to me that what was going on in St. Louis was way outside the normal limits of what we see in U.S. cities. There are those dangerous parts. You generally know not to go there. There is kind of an urban decline, which can be seen in a lack of services, graffiti, uncut grass. But I didn't navigate St. Louis or think of St. Louis any differently than I thought of Kansas City or Washington, D.C. or Boston or any other place I'd been.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up the population of the city, the MSA. It seems like when there are national or even local news stories written on crime statistics in St. Louis, it people will point out that okay, if you're not talking about the larger metropolitan area, that you get down into actually a pretty small population number for U.S. cities. So for this work that we're going to be talking about, can you kind of define what area you guys looked at? And when we say murders are XXX, what area are we specifically talking about?
Well, we looked at the city of St. Louis specifically. So just those few square miles. We did not look at the metropolitan area, and we did not look at the county. It is fair to want to combine all that data point into one region, but oftentimes I think people want to do that to mask the seriousness of homicide and violent crime and property crime in the city. And that's what we wanted to talk about. And what is true in St. Louis is not unique to St. Louis. Kansas City has a crime problem that is not reflected in our metropolitan area. That's true in Washington, D.C., Atlanta, Los Angeles, everywhere. So I understand that people who live in St. Louis feel that, um, you can cook the numbers by just looking at the city, but that's true in every urban environment.
We also compared St. Louis to four other cities, and one of them in particular, Cincinnati, ended up being very similar. Wrote a paper, and in the back of the paper, there's a table that has variables on which we compared them. Similar size, similar poverty, similar median income, very, very similar. So to say that St. Louis is this very unique outlier and is the only city in the United States that has this situation where, essentially 100+ years ago, St. Louis was so much better and more metropolitan and forward thinking than the rest of the state of Missouri and safer and wealthier that they drew a line around the city of St. Louis and said, we are going to be our own thing and we're going to have our own police. And it was called the Great Divorce. And we don't want to be merged into the rest of Missouri. We're going to be our own thing. Now that line, sort of the arrows are pointing different ways where the county, St. Louis County, isn't necessarily excited to absorb the city of St. Louis and their services and systems and police departments and 911 systems into the county because it is a uniquely sort of crime-ridden area in parts of it. So while it would be nice to, as Patrick mentioned, just sort of water down all the numbers by mixing them into a safer pot, it would really mask what's going on.
And Susan, you use the word unique there to kind of describe the setup. Patrick, um, does that genuinely make it harder to talk about this topic when we're talking about St. Louis? Like in the last few months, you've had some public events. We're going to talk about those in a minute. But as you've gone through this process, do you think the unique setup has made it harder? There's more throat clearing and definitional work that goes into it.
Well, again, I don't know that what St. Louis is dealing with is unique. Yes, the city has a particularly small footprint. Yes, it is as if you kind of drew a line around just the bad neighborhood in your community and tried to use that small footprint to describe the whole area. So I get that argument, but if it's true by a matter of degree, it's not true, unique to St. Louis, and it's something that the city needs to deal with and understand rather than try to paper over, as Susan said. There are real problems in the city. Their population decline is only exacerbating those problems because there's less revenue. And frankly, the history of the city, going back decades now, has been the image of the city has been that it is dysfunctional, and not just on public safety, on lots of issues. And so, although I understand that people say, well, look, we don't just want to talk about the city when it comes to crime, I think St. Louis is, while it's got lots of opportunities and lots of strengths, we don't do ourselves any favors by combining all this stuff and whistling past the graveyard. People in this country know that St. Louis has a crime problem. We don't solve it by redirecting people.
Okay, and let's talk about that crime problem. So, Susan, when we use the word crime in this context, what are we talking about? Are we talking about murders? We talking about car break-ins? Lay it out for us.
So we have violent crime and property crime. Violent crime is murders, aggravated assault, robbery, property crimes, larceny, motor vehicle thefts, violent
Uh,
crimes and property crimes, basically. And in our report, we break them all out separately. And murders are the one crime area that people. Well, I don't know. The media likes to focus on how many murders, which city is the murder capital. Did we have 150? Did we have 200? Are they down? They are certainly down in the last 2 years. To be clear, murder rates are down. Aggravated assault rates are not down by as much. And, sometimes the difference between aggravated assault and murder is how fast the ambulance drives. Like we still have a lot of violent crimes against people happening. We certainly have a lot of motor vehicle thefts. That is, area of crime that spiked in COVID, and particularly for Kias and Hyundais. And it's come down, but it's still a very high number. So, while it is wonderful that crime has come down across these areas, in many cases, they're still pretty high, and particularly on a per capita basis, which we translate all the crime rates into per capita so that we can compare them with other cities. But yeah, so we break the crime out into those categories.
So you said crime is down, and so it's fair to classify it as it was really bad, and now it's just bad. It was terrible. Now it's just bad. How would you kind of summarize what you found with the drop in crime?
I mean, crime's been dropping since the 80s, right? So we had much worse crime decades ago, and it's been dropping. It spiked during the pandemic, and it is continuing basically down. Now, when you look at murder rate per capita in the city of St. Louis, it is still on a slightly upward trend, the number of murders per people. And that could be driven by the fact that Missouri is losing population at a pretty good clip. We have more deaths than births. Um, so on a per capita basis, maybe not quite the same, but in terms of actual numbers, crime has been coming down for some time. And I imagine that there's a number of reasons for that, but crime overall peaked in the late 80s and 90s.
And Patrick, we talked about your perception and relevant to many other cities. Did that surprise you? Did the findings that crime is down, did that surprise you, or was that kind of what you expected?
No, I don't think the data that said that crime in St. Louis was down was a surprise. It certainly was nice to see that it's been down year after year. This doesn't appear to be just a one-off, uh, uh, good year. And I've known that the mayor and the police chief have been talking about these positive numbers for a while. I think really what I was interested in this paper that Susan and I worked on was to talk about perception of crime. That's what I've really wrestled with, both in events in the city and in the county. Um, it is um, it is a difficult problem to overcome because you can have good numbers like St. Louis has, and yet people still rely on that decades old impression. And again, that's not something that you can address just by waving away the numbers downtown. You really have to wrestle with it. You have to admit it, and you have to set up. First of all, you've got to figure out how do you get people to accept good news, and then how do you make them confident that that good news is going to continue. And again, it's so easy these days, especially with cities, to just be a pessimist and to say that things are down and will ever continue to go down. And uh, it is a problem that St. Louis has, but St. Louis isn't alone in having that. The news on crime is good all over the country, yet perceptions about crime all over the country are still with us.
Yeah, there's a surveys question that's often asked, which is, do you feel safe walking outside alone at night? And those numbers aren't down. And as Patrick mentioned, you have graffiti and trash not being picked up and panhandling and homelessness in general. Those numbers aren't necessarily down. But we did look in the paper, we did look at St. Louis on a neighborhood by neighborhood basis. And it is true that there are, out of 16 neighborhoods, 4 or 5 that don't have no crime, basically, that are crime free. But then there are some other pockets that have most of the murders in one neighborhood. So it isn't across all the neighborhoods equally. There's some that have very little crime, but it's hard to convince folks when they drive through the ones that have this public disorder and you still don't feel safe.
And Susan, someone trying to, as a researcher, trying to ultimately figure out why things happen. You mentioned that crime is down across the country. Would it be easier if it was just a few select cities across, and then you would actually be able to go and say, like, oh, what is Boston doing different? What is Memphis doing? Does it actually make it harder since to find the why, since it does seem like it's kind of across the board?
Yeah, I mean, there've been other periods of time when crime's gone down and then it's gone back up again. Now, I personally believe, and this is not based on any research I've done or anything else, but you've got cameras absolutely everywhere. Like, you cannot basically travel through the world anymore without being on a camera somewhere. That makes it harder to commit crimes. Um, Police body cams probably make it harder to commit crimes. I feel like we're getting into the more of a surveillance state, and maybe that's what's bringing crime down. But certainly, if there were some outlier cities, I've heard that Detroit's brought crime down faster than other cities. I've heard about Pittsburgh feeling safer now, Chattanooga feeling safer. It'd be worthwhile and Memphis feeling less safe. So it'd be worthwhile to look into some of these differences. But um, it, I don't think that our research yet pointed to a clear reason why it's happening.
And let me follow up with that because Susan's exactly right. And I think your question gets to that point, which is crime is down nationwide. It's down in all cities, if I remember correctly, um, and and we don't really know why. And it's not just Susan and I that don't know why. Susan's spoken with public safety and crime experts from all over the country. And that's really frustrating from a public policy research point of view, because you would love to have that outlier, that one city, maybe Boston or Omaha, right? That tried something novel and got results unlike everybody else. But crime is so difficult because there are so many contributors, right? Some people want to point to the availability of guns. Some people want to talk about root causes. Some people want to talk about the number of police, the severity of crime, the clearance rate, um, population growth, new development, basic services, picking up the trash and making sure the streetlights work. And all of those things are right. All those things contribute. So it's really difficult to figure out which is contributing. And sometimes, as Susan pointed out, you may just get a dip, and there's no explaining it. In 2014, in Kansas City, our mayor and police chief at the time came out and had a press conference because they were so proud of the homicide drop the previous year. And there was a lot of backslapping and self-congratulation. And then when the crime rate, specifically the homicide rate, went back up the next year, you couldn't get those guys to answer a basic question. So policymakers need to be, and maybe they are, really shy about claiming credit because they don't, a year after, want to be called to task because those numbers reverse themselves. So, I mean, the good news, I guess, is that the numbers are trending down. That's always good. The frustration is it's very difficult to figure out why, and then make recommendations. Do this, not that. We're all kind of scratching our heads. Although, again, this is a good problem to have. The numbers are heading in the right direction, and we ought to be happy about that.
And so, Patrick, to get a better idea of the perception, you did the hard work of going to the people. So in January and February, you moderated events. We had one in the city of St. Louis, one in St. Louis County. There are full recordings of the events available, showmeinstitute.org. You can find them. But so you had a panel of experts, and you did spend a lot of time getting feedback from the attendees, who were people who lived in the county, who lived in the city. I guess to start with, so what were your takeaways from that event, from things that you heard from attendees? Are they buying that the crime's getting better?
No. In a word, they don't. We gave them a short survey before they came to the event. A lot of them believed that crime was important, certainly, but they didn't necessarily believe that crime was getting better. They weren't necessarily optimistic that crime was going to be better in St. Louis City in the next 5 years, and that was certainly true in the county. And I wanted to press these audience members. What would it take for you to believe this good news? And I think sometimes they were just they didn't want to believe anything. We got the frustrating line, which is, well, there's lies, damn lies, and statistics. That's a cute thing to say, but it really doesn't help you explain your own view if you're just going to say, no, I believe it's bad, and I believe it's always going to be bad. And so, we were happy to have representatives from the circuit attorney office at both events, and they struggle with this too. They can do a better job. They can prosecute more and different cases. They can do it faster. The police certainly can improve their clearance rate, but public policy makers in those cities, in every city, are going to have to realize that they may have to continue that grind, doing the hard work of lowering crime, and they're not going to get the attaboys from the people in their city or the communities around them. And that's just a reality. One of the panelists we had talked about how perceptions of crime was often a lagging indicator. When crime goes up, people feel it immediately. But when crime goes down, it may take a few years. And so the tough news for the people who lead St. Louis City is you may have to keep doing this for another 10 years before you get any credit for being successful. And that's really tough in politics because people want that immediate payoff, that immediate applause, that immediate press conference and support.
Patrick and I have been thinking about this, and the things that could happen that could make a difference, that could maybe make people feel safer, is number one, when you see a crime happening, you need to be able to have faith that you can report it and it will get reported. and somebody will respond, basically. And that is not happening right now in the city of St. Louis. We called several times about crimes and nobody showed up. So you need to have faith in the 911 system, and the 911 system needs to function. And we have like 28 different systems in the county. They're building a new 911 center in the city that's going to consolidate services, but it's not finished. And they're going to be adding next generation services to it, but it's going to be some time before that's high functioning. We also need to know that the police will be able to solve these crimes. They need their resources that it takes. They need to be able to do DNA testing and rape kits and DNA. They need money to do those things. They need detectives. We need to know that these crimes can get solved. And then we need to know that the crimes will get prosecuted. I think if these pieces on the front end, not just the like lock them up thing, but like on the front end, people would feel safer if they felt like if they saw a crime, they could call somebody and somebody would respond and something would happen. I'm not sure that that's happening right now. And until it does, people are going to, especially people when they start having small children, they're going to probably move out.
What we've known since at least 1961, when Jane Jacobs wrote the uh, Death and Life of Great American Cities, is that you sometimes just need eyes on the street. Shop owners, pedestrians, people walking around. Absolutely, cameras can reduce crime, but they're kind of abstract and tucked in corners. When a street is vibrant, when it's got people living there, when you've got, kids playing in the street and families on the porch, there's that sense of, I'm being watched, I'm being seen, this is good. But because St. Louis has been in this population spiral, how do you bring people back into the city? The city talks about economic development subsidies all the time, but that's about bringing in amenities. That's about bringing in employers. Maybe what the city needs to do is figure out how can we bring in people, and oftentimes, and this kind of gets us off topic, but oftentimes it's the non-crime related policies, right? The housing policies, the regulations, the tax structure that keep people out. Crime is one of those, but certainly the city could kind of open itself up to urban homesteaders who want to come in, who want to rehab these old houses. And what has stricken me about St. Louis for the decades I've been going there is just the absolutely beautiful old neighborhoods, the incredible housing stock. Susan talked about living in a house that was built for the World's Fair. I mean, there are gorgeous neighborhoods in St. Louis, and it's just the barriers of entry that are keeping people out, I have to believe. And that is, again, red tape, government regulation. Crime is one of them, to be sure. But I am confident there are people that would love to move into those old houses, would love to revitalize those old neighborhoods because they're just so gorgeous and those neighborhoods are walkable. And it's been done in other cities. DuPont Circle in Washington, D.C. was a slow process of kind of rehabbing neighborhoods block by block. And now, 30 years later, it is a vibrant community.
Susan, you mentioned the 911 system. I know that in the report you don't get into specific solutions, but I don't know what are the other. I know we're still kind of in a measuring the problem, trying to figure out what next steps are. But beyond the 911 system, are there any you think like low hanging fruit that we should at least consider moving forward?
Well, the governor or the legislature passed last year, and the governor signed a violent crime clearance grant program that cities like St. Louis could apply for funding to hire detectives, do DNA testing, collect data, other activities directly focused on solving crimes. The legislature has not appropriated any money for that program. So if they did appropriate money, St. Louis could apply for funds for that. I don't know the exact number as I say this, but at least 100 open police positions in the department. Those are hard to fill. The way that the policies that have been tossed around or implemented are no longer requiring police officers to live within the city. Across the board raises, none of those have really made a difference. So we need to get at some recruitment and retention policies that could really work. And also, like I mentioned with the 911 system, triaging problems, making sure that the correct agency responds when a crime has been committed. There's community violence intervention programs that have been tried in some places, and like looking at the data, the neighborhood by neighborhood data, being able to focus in on where crimes are really happening. Those types of things are things that we would like to explore more to see like what is the fiscal what is the cost of these programs? What is the likelihood that they'll improve things? And what are some feasible ways to get them done?
So there's the PR part of it. The city's got a PR problem. There's the we need more cops. We need people to be able to call 911. We need people to actually be prosecuted for crimes. That all seems doable. Where do you think the city of St. Louis is at right now? Just from a, are we in a good place? You would say, are we in just an improved place? And people, it could be a few years. What? How are you feeling about public safety in the city of St. Louis right now?
Well, I guess I don't want to be a wet blanket. I love the city of St. Louis and I want it to succeed wildly. But I'm concerned that they're going to say murders are down and these other crimes are down, but people are still running stop signs and running stoplights and still, there's still panhandlers and there's still trash not being picked up. And they're not really fixing the small things that make people feel safe. They're sort of focused on these big numbers. It could be like a school improving ACT scores, but like you have to be really careful if they're just focusing on this one aspect that these big crime numbers are down because it could be hiding a lot of other stuff that it really needs to be done and to be focused on. So I'm cautiously optimistic, I guess.
I'm optimistic because crime is going down everywhere. I think it will probably continue to go down, at least for the next few years, everywhere for reasons that have nothing to do with the management of St. Louis. And part of it is because, and Susan and I have been reviewing this for the last few months, there is so much research out there, primary on crime and secondary, that talks about exactly the things that Susan hit upon, which is, the environment, the trash being picked up, cleaning up graffiti, fixing sidewalks, making sure those street lights are lit. We know so much more about what drives crime, or at least what can ameliorate it, that even if we don't know the specifics of what's going on now, city leaders and state leaders are much more aware of what they can do to make communities not just safer, but feel safe. And again, it is frustrating because you can say that the numbers are down, but until people feel safe and want to go down and take advantage of what the city has to offer, we're not going to see that public perception change. So yes, I think the public perception is accurate in as much as that is what people feel, but I don't think it reflects what's actually going on in St. Louis or in the county.
And we will leave it there. So there's the report, the public safety climate in the city of St. Louis, that will be available at showmeinstitute.org. Again, if you want to watch the full recordings of the events that Patrick moderated, those are available right now at showmeinstitute.org. Susan, Patrick, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.